The 20th century, the era of iconic fashion trends, endless scientific innovations, and economic spikes. Shockingly, it also carries the biggest tragedies of the 20th century that may have been entirely preventable under the right conditions and policies. In today's video, we will share 9 of the biggest tragedies of the 1900s. Your discretion is advised as the video will contain facts that may be sensitive to some. World War I and II. Estimated death toll, 100 to 200 million. Unbelievably, the 20th century survived not one but 2 world wars. A world war is an international conflict that involves the majority or all of the world's megapowers and shifts the direction of power holds. The First World War lasted from 1914 until 1918, the scale of which was made possible by technological developments during the Second Industrial Revolution and the ensuing globalization. War crimes were committed. Chemical weapons were used throughout the conflict, despite the fact that the Hague Conventions of 1899 and 1907 prohibited the use of such weapons. The word genocide was first used to appropriately call out the crimes that saw ends of an entire race. The Ottoman Empire was accused of committing a crime against humanity due to its persecution of Christian minorities such as Armenians, Assyrians, and Greeks. Estimates for the number of Anatolian Greeks murdered range from 348,000 to 900,000. World War I witnessed an estimated death toll of approximately 20 million, with historians struggling to categorize endless war crimes. But it wasn't the end of suffering, because World War II was deadlier and messier, with approximately 70 to 85 million people dead and millions displaced. During the Nanjing Massacre, which occurred in the early months of the Second Sino-Japanese War, the Japanese massacred the city's Chinese populace, murdering at least 200,000 people among other atrocities. Joseph Stalin ordered the ethnic cleansing and deportation of the Crimean Tatars from Crimea as a collective punishment for their alleged cooperation with the Nazi-occupying authorities in Taurida sub-district between 1942 and 1943. In Crimea, the removal coordinated by the state of ethnic Crimean Tatar population is referred to as the Surgunlik. Around 230,000 people were deported, and over 100,000 people succumbed to starvation and lack of health care. Historians and scientists believe the Kazakh famine of 1932 to 1933 by the Soviet authorities was also a systematic persecution campaign against Kazakh nomads, thus can be classified as genocide. Moreover, the Russian Revolution in the 20th century set off a chain of events that resulted in the genocide of Ingrian Finns, during which the Soviet Union slaughtered, imprisoned, and deported Ingrians while destroying their culture. This historically eliminated the word Ingria in the process. There were between 140,000 and 160,000 Ingrians in Russia prior to the persecution, and currently there are only a few thousand left worldwide. Spanish flu pandemic. Estimated death toll, 50 to 100 million. But it wasn't always just wars that created tragedies. The world witnessed an uncontrollable tragedy that lasted over 2 years from 1918 to 1920, which is often referred to as the Great Influenza Epidemic or the Spanish flu. In March 1918, the first case was reported in the U.S. state of Kansas. In April, further instances were reported in France, Germany, and the United Kingdom. 2 years later, the pandemic spread in 4 waves, affecting an estimated 500 million people, or about a third of the world's population. It is one of the deadliest pandemics in history, with estimates of deaths ranging from 17 million to 50 million, and maybe as high as 100 million. Although there had been cases prior to Albert Gitchell, the case of the Army chef at Camp Funston in Kansas, United States on March 4, 1918 is traditionally considered to have marked the start of the pandemic. The disease swiftly spread from Camp Funston, a significant training ground for the American Expeditionary Forces soldiers, to other U.S. Army camps in Europe after the United States entered World War I. By April 1918, it had become a major epidemic in the Midwest, East Coast, and French ports, and by the middle of the month, it had reached the Western Front. The flu's initial wave, which began in the first quarter of 1918, was comparatively mild. In the United States, approximately 75,000 flu-related deaths were reported in the first half of 1918, compared to approximately 63,000 deaths during the same period in 1915, indicating that mortality rates were not significantly higher than usual. In May and June 1918, influenza killed less than 1,000 individuals in Madrid, Spain. In the first quarter of 1918, there were no quarantines that were known to exist. However, with over 900,000 German men, half the British forces and three-quarters of the French troops ill, the first wave seriously disrupted World War I military operations. The second wave started near the end of August 1918, and the virus most likely traveled by ship from Brest to Boston, Massachusetts and Freetown, Sierra Leone. According to studies, American soldiers or French recruits were a point of spread who were traveling for naval training. Over the course of the following 2 months, it expanded throughout North America with the aid of troop movements, then to Central and South America, and finally via ships to Brazil and the Caribbean. The first occurrences were reported in a few soldiers in the Ottoman Empire in July 1918. Between September and December 1918, there were around 292,000 recorded deaths in the United States, compared to approximately 26,000 during the same period in 1915. Over 40,000 influenza and acute respiratory disease-related deaths were documented in the Netherlands. Approximately 15,000 people died in Bombay, which had approximately 1.1 million residents living at the time. With an estimated 12.5 to 20 million deaths in the final quarter of 1918 alone, the 1918 flu pandemic in India was particularly lethal. During the first half of 1919, these factors were responsible for around 160,000 deaths. 780,000 instances were documented throughout Japan between October 1919 and January 23, 1920, and at that time, at least 20,000 deaths had been reported. In late 1919 and early 1920, strong epidemics also occurred in Korea and Taiwan. So, in the first half of the century, this pandemic alone erased 6% of the world population back then. By the time it was over, 500 million people, roughly one-third of the world's population, had contracted the Spanish flu. Newspapers openly reported the outbreak in neutral Spain, giving the mistaken impression that Spain was the epicenter and giving rise to the misnomer Spanish flu. The pandemic began around the conclusion of World War I, when wartime censors in the warring countries suppressed unfavorable news to promote morale. The geographic origin of the pandemic is uncertain due to a lack of historical epidemiological data, and there are conflicting theories on its first spread. This pandemic had an unusually high fatality rate among young adults, in contrast to typical influenza outbreaks back then, which primarily affected the very young and the elderly, while sparing those in between. Around this time, a new theory gained popularity, suggesting that a 6-year climate anomaly might have contributed to the increased disease transmission. Scientists also believed that the spread through bodies of water potentially elevated the mortality rate. However, the majority of the victims died after a normally drawn-out deathbed due to bacterial superinfection caused by malnourishment, congested medical camps and hospitals, and inadequate cleanliness that was made worse by the conflict. The H1N1 influenza A virus was no ordinary virus and was responsible for 3 flu pandemics, including the 2009 swine flu and the 1977 Russian flu. This may have resulted in the deaths of over 100 million people altogether. The Spanish flu tragedy reflected how underprepared the world was when it came to global pandemics and how little prevention measures were in place. While the pandemic was a biological crisis, another similar event caused humans to rethink their measures when it came to agricultural devastation due to human policies. Mao's Great Leap Forward famine. Estimated death toll, 30 to 45 million. Mid-1900, the Chinese Communist Party carried out the Great Leap Forward, a 5-year plan of forced agricultural collectivization and rural industrialization. Initiated in 1958, the plan caused a severe economic downturn in China and between 30 and 45 million deaths from starvation, execution, torture, forced labor, and desperate suicide. It was the biggest mass murder campaign in human history that did not occur during an armed conflict. The People's Republic of China's founder, Mao Zedong, spearheaded the effort. Mao's stated objective was to quickly transform China from an agrarian economy into a contemporary industrial society that could more effectively compete with industrialized Western countries. Rural farmers were compelled to labor on collective farms, where the Communist Party controlled all aspects of production, resource distribution, and food distribution after private plot farming was outlawed. With minimal assistance from qualified engineers, extensive irrigation projects were started, and new experimental farming methods were swiftly implemented across the nation. Due to unsuccessful experiments and poorly planned water projects, these measures further decreased food yields. In the absence of the sparrow's natural predation, a statewide push to eradicate the sparrows, which Mao mistakenly believed to be a significant pest on grain crops, led to large locust swarms. Grain production plummeted, and hundreds of thousands perished from weather-related illnesses and forced labor on communal farming and irrigation construction projects. Famine swiftly spread over the countryside, killing millions more people. People turned to cannibalism in certain places and to eating dirt and tree bark. Along with their family members, farmers who did not satisfy grain quotas, attempted to obtain more food, or tried to flee were tortured and executed by beatings, public mutilations, burials while still alive, searing with hot water, and other means. In the first year of the Great Leap Forward, steel production was supposed to double. Mao unrealistically claimed that within 15 years, Chinese industrial output would surpass that of Britain's. However, their production was nothing more than pig iron from the backyard steel industry and was of poor quality, mostly unusable. Millions of surplus workers were transferred from agricultural work to the steel industry. Men made up the majority, severing families and abandoning the forced agricultural labor force for collective farms dominated by women, children, and elderly people. In the end, the Great Leap Forward was a complete failure. Within a few years, tens of millions perished from starvation, exposure, overwork, and execution. It devastated traditional communities and ways of life and split families apart, sending men, women, and children to separate places. In order to feed the steel furnaces, the landscape was stripped of trees and farmland was harmed by absurd farming methods. To acquire raw materials for group projects, between 30 and 40% of the dwelling stock was destroyed. 3 bloody years of murder and devastation later, the Great Leap Forward was formally stopped in January 1961. As a result of Mao Zedong's unsuccessful attempt to turn tiny family farms into urbanized communes, up to 45 million people perished from famine and diseases during the Great Leap Forward. Mao's Great Leap Forward plan led to widespread suffering, but another catastrophic showcase may even overshadow it and place itself as a devastating chapter in human history. Atomic bombing of Hiroshima and Nagasaki. Estimated death toll 150,000 to 230,000. It was the year 1945. The Pacific War between the Empire of Japan and the Allies reached its last stage. The Allies readied themselves for an extensive attack on the Japanese mainland in the last year of World War II. A conventional bombing and firebombing campaign that destroyed 64 Japanese cities, including Tokyo, came before this endeavor. After Germany's surrender on May 8, 1945, the war in the European theater came to a conclusion, and the Allies focused entirely on the Pacific War. Fat Man was a plutonium-based implosion-type nuclear weapon, and Little Boy was an enriched uranium-based gun-type fission weapon. Both were built by the Allies' Manhattan Project by July 1945. The United States Army Air Force's 509th Composite Group was sent to Tinian in the Mariana Islands after receiving training and being outfitted with the customized silver plate version of the Boeing B-29 Super Fortress. In the Potsdam Declaration on July 26, 1945, the Allies demanded the unconditional surrender of the Imperial Japanese military, citing prompt and utter destruction as an alternative. The ultimatum was disregarded by the Japanese administration. Hiroshima was a significant military and industrial metropolis at the time of the bombing. Nearby were several military installations, chief among them the headquarters of Field Marshal Shunroku Hata's 2nd General Army, based in Hiroshima Castle and responsible for the defense of all southern Japan. On August 6th, Hiroshima was the main target of the first atomic bombing campaign, with Kokura and Nagasaki serving as backup targets. Due to the force and heat of the bombings themselves, an estimated 90,000 to 166,000 people, which was between 26 and 49% of the population of Hiroshima, and 60,000 to 80,000 people, which was between 22 and 32% of the population of Nagasaki, perished in 1945. In both cases, the majority of these deaths occurred on the days of the bombings. Due to radiation exposure and the difficulties that followed, almost all of the remaining victims passed away within 2 to 4 months. According to a report by the Atomic Bomb Casualty Commission, 6,882 individuals who were analyzed in Hiroshima and 6,621 individuals who were analyzed in Nagasaki were mostly within 2,000 meters or 6,600 feet of the hypocenter. They were injured by the blast and the heat, but they passed away within 20 to 30 days due to complications that were often exacerbated by acute radiation syndrome, or ARS in quick terms. The first death that was formally recognized as being caused by radiation poisoning, or as many called it the atomic bomb disease, was Midori Naka. She would die on August 24, 1945, following a journey to Tokyo, about 650 meters or 2,130 feet from the hypocenter at Hiroshima. Following attachment, birth abnormalities and cancer took many more lives and left countless others crippled before they ultimately met their demise. The Great Famine of Bengal. Estimated death toll approximates over 5 million. Imagine a tiny nation of 40 million people going through 2 famines, 2 wars, and 2 devastating natural disasters in a single century. The Bangladesh famine of 1974 began in March and concluded around December of that year. The famine is regarded as one of the worst of the 20th century. It was caused by government mismanagement, food grain smuggling to neighboring nations, and floods along the Brahmaputra River, among other factors, resulting in high mortality. Warnings of famine began in March 1974, when the price of rice skyrocketed. In this month, widespread starvation began in Rangpur district, which would become one of the 3 most affected areas. It had barely been 2 years and 3 months since the end of the battle for Bangladeshi independence and the country's formal establishment in December 1971. In terms of total mortality, while estimates differ, one expert believes 1.5 million fatalities are feasible, though a significant number of historians believe the number could have been higher. This figure includes post-famine mortality. Cholera, malaria, and diarrhea were all major causes of mortality, not only starvation. As with most famines, weakened disease-prone circumstances led to a high post-famine mortality rate of over 450,000. The poor, workers, and non-landowners were particularly vulnerable. The Bangladesh famine, like most other famines, had several causes. These included floods, fast population increase, government mishandling of food grain inventories, legislation limiting food grain mobility between districts, food grain smuggling to neighboring nations, and so-called distributional failures. Unfortunately, this wasn't the only famine the people of Bangladesh faced during the 1900s. During World War II, the Bengal famine of 1943 occurred in British India's Bengal area, now Bangladesh, West Bengal, and eastern India. From the late 19th century until the Great Depression, social and economic dynamics had a negative influence on the structure of Bengal's income distribution and the agricultural sector's ability to feed the population. These dynamics included rising family debt, a fast-expanding population, stagnated agricultural production, greater social inequality, and the alienation of peasants from their land holdings. The shocks Bengalis experienced in 1942 and 1943 under the immediate and major backdrop of World War II were many, complicated, and often unexpected. Millions of people were at risk of hunger. In the end, an estimated 0.8 to 3.8 million Bengalis died. By November 1943, the number of deaths from famine had reached its high. Disease began a rapid upward turn in October 1943 and surpassed malnutrition as the most prevalent cause of death by December. Chinese Civil War. Estimated death toll approximately 12 million. The Chinese Civil War was fought between the Republic of China's Kuomintang-led government and the Chinese Communist Party's forces, also called CCP forces in short, with armed conflict lasting intermittently from 1st August 1927 until communist victory resulted in total control of mainland China on December 7, 1949. The conflict is often split into 2 parts, with an intermission. From August 1927 to 1937, the First United Front coalition of the KMT and CCP dissolved during the Northern Expedition, leaving the nationalists in control of the majority of China. From 1937 until 1945, hostilities were generally halted while the Second United Front battled the Japanese invasion of China with the ultimate assistance of the allies of World War II. However, violent confrontations between the parties continued. When it became clear that Japan would be defeated, the Civil War continued, with the Communists obtaining the upper hand in the second phase of the conflict, known as the Chinese Communist Revolution, which lasted from 1945 to 1949. In 1949, the Communists took control of mainland China and established the People's Republic of China, forcing the Republic of China's leadership to flee to Taiwan. Following the collapse of the Qing Empire and the 1911 Revolution, Sun Yat-sen became president of the newly founded Republic of China, and Yuan Shikai followed him shortly thereafter. Yuan failed in his brief attempt to re-establish monarchy in China, and China devolved into a power struggle following his death in 1916. The Kuomintang, or KMT, led by Sun Yat-sen, established a new administration in Guangzhou to compete with the warlords who dominated huge areas of China, preventing the creation of a strong central government. Sun resorted to the Soviet Union after his attempts to seek funding from Western countries were unsuccessful. In 1923, Sun dispatched one of his lieutenants, Chiang Kai-shek, to Moscow for many months of military and political training. Chiang then became the head of the Whampoa Military Academy, which taught the next generation of military officers. However, upon Sun's death in 1925, the KMT divided into left and right-wing forces. In early 1927, the KMT-CCP conflict caused a rift in the revolutionary ranks. The CCP and the left wing of the KMT resolved to relocate the KMT government's headquarters from Guangzhou to Wuhan, where communist influence was strong. During Japan's invasion and occupation of Manchuria, Chiang Kai-shek viewed the CCP as a larger menace. Chiang declined to form an alliance with the CCP, wanting to unify China by first destroying the warlord and CCP troops. He considered that his forces were insufficient to confront the Japanese Imperial Army. Only after unity could the KMT mobilize against Japan. He overlooked the Chinese people's displeasure and indignation with the KMT's policy of compromise with the Japanese. During the conflict, both the nationalists and the communists committed major crimes, with both sides deliberately killing millions of non-combatants. Between 1927 and 1949, crimes during the Chinese Civil War killed between 1.8 million and 3.5 million people, according to Benjamin Valentino's estimates. Following the 1927 Shanghai Massacre, the Kuomintang slaughtered between 300,000 and 1 million people, mostly peasants, in anti-communist campaigns as part of the White Terror. During the White Terror, the nationalists targeted women with short hair who had not been subjected to foot binding, assuming that such non-traditional ladies were radical. To terrify the population, nationalist troops severed their breasts, shaved their heads, and showed their maimed bodies. Torture, sexual violence, and collective punishment were popular nationalist tactics throughout counterinsurgency actions. The nationalists uprooted and relocated entire towns to make it easier to monitor communist activity. Between 1946 and 1949, the nationalists used the Sino-American Cooperative Organization to imprison, torture, and execute political dissidents. During the December 1930 Futian incident, communists murdered 2,000 to 3,000 soldiers of the Futian Battalion when its commanders rebelled against Mao Zedong. Between 1931 and 1934, communist officials in the Jiangxi Fujian Soviet engaged in an extensive campaign of brutality against citizens to secure conformity with their policies and prevent defection to the advancing KMT, which included mass executions, land seizure, and forced labor. Between 1931 and 1935, the population of the communist-controlled territory plummeted by 700,000, with a considerable proportion executed as class enemies, working to death, committing suicide, or dying in other communist-related situations. During the siege of Changchun, the People's Liberation Army erected a military blockade around the KMT-held city of Changchun, preventing inhabitants from fleeing. This siege resulted in the starvation of tens to hundreds of thousands of civilians. Infamous Khmer Rouge, estimated death toll 1.5 to 2 million. The term Khmer Rouge refers to members of the Communist Party of Kampuchea, or CPK, and by extension the Democratic Kampuchea, which controlled Cambodia from 1975 to 1979. Norodom Sihanouk developed the moniker in the 1960s to designate his country's diverse communist-led rebels, with whom he partnered during the 1970 Cambodian coup d'etat. During the late 1960s, the Kampuchea Revolutionary Army was gradually built up in eastern Cambodia's jungles with help from the People's Army of Vietnam, the Viet Cong, the Pathet Lao, and the Chinese Communist Party. Although it initially opposed Sihanouk, the Khmer Rouge altered its attitude and backed Sihanouk on the advice of the CCP when he was deposed in a 1970 coup d'etat by Lon Nol, who founded the pro-American Khmer Republic. Despite a large American bombing operation known as Operation Freedom Deal, the Khmer Rouge won the Cambodian Civil War by capturing the Cambodian capital and overthrowing the Khmer Republic in 1975. Following their triumph, the Khmer Rouge, commanded by Pol Pot, Nuon Chea, Lang Sari, Son Sen, and Khieu Samphan, proceeded to forcibly evacuate the country's major cities. In 1976, the country was renamed Democratic Kampuchea. The Khmer Rouge rule was very authoritarian, dictatorial, and oppressive. Many people died as a result of the regime's social engineering efforts and the Moalat Plow, which was modeled after China's Great Leap Forward, which caused the Great Chinese Famine. The Khmer Rouge dictatorship killed hundreds of thousands of perceived political opponents, and its discriminatory emphasis on national purity led to the genocide of Cambodian minorities. Between 1975 and 1978, its cadres committed summary killings and torture against supposed dissident members, as well as genocidal purges of their own ranks. Ultimately, the Cambodian genocide carried out by the Khmer Rouge dictatorship resulted in the deaths of 1.5 to 2 million people, or around 25% of Cambodia's population. The Cambodian genocide is often recorded as the epitome of devastating consequence of political failure. But another tragedy, though widely known around the world, may be the epitome of human error and systemic failure. The Chernobyl nuclear disaster. Estimated death toll neared 93,000, including long-term effects. The Chernobyl tragedy began on April 26, 1986, with a nuclear meltdown of the Chernobyl nuclear power plant's No. 4 reactor in the city of Pripyat in northern Ukraine, near the Belarus border in the Soviet Union. Being one of only 2 nuclear energy incidents regarded as the most severe on the international nuclear event scale, this tragedy held headlines for years. In 2019, the reaction required more than 500,000 individuals and cost an estimated 18 billion rubles, or around $68 billion USD. It is still the biggest nuclear accident in history and the most expensive calamity in human history, with an estimated cost of $700 billion USD. The incident happened while executing a test to mimic cooling the reactor following an accident under blackout conditions. The operators conducted the test despite an unintentional decline in reactor power, and attempting to shut down the reactor under such conditions resulted in a huge power spike owing to a design flaw. The reactor components burst, coolants leaked, and the subsequent steam explosions and meltdown destroyed the containment building, followed by a nuclear core fire that spewed radioactive pollutants throughout the USSR and Europe. A 10-kilometer or 6.2-mile exclusion zone was formed 36 hours after the catastrophe, displacing around 49,000 people. The exclusion zone was then enlarged to 30 kilometers or 19 miles, resulting in the evacuation of an additional 68,000 individuals. After the explosion, which killed 2 engineers and badly burnt 2 others, an emergency operation was launched to extinguish the fires and stabilize the reactor. Of the 237 workers hospitalized, 134 had signs of acute radiation syndrome, also known as ARS, and 28 died within 3 months. Over the next decade, 14 additional workers died of different reasons, the most of which were unconnected to radiation exposure, including 9 with ARS. It is the first time in commercial nuclear power history that radiation-related deaths occurred. As of 2011, 15 children with thyroid cancer fatalities had been linked to the accident. Although it is impossible to compare the Chernobyl catastrophe to an intentional airburst nuclear detonation, Chernobyl is believed to have discharged around 400 times more radioactive material than the combined atomic bombs of Hiroshima and Nagasaki. Approximately 100,000 square kilometers, or nearly 39,000 square miles of land were considered poisoned, with Belarus, Ukraine, and Russia being the most severely affected. Following the disaster, the media increased public distrust of medical experts. This media-driven framing resulted in an upsurge of induced abortions across Europe due to radiation worries. Radiophobia is thought to have resulted in around 150,000 elective abortions globally. Human errors and mismanagement may have been a leading cause in the tragedy of the Chernobyl disaster, but we know of another instance where overconfidence in human innovation created an unthinkable tragedy. Heralded as the unsinkable, Titanic was a marvel of ship engineering of the 20th century and a floating palace of the sea. The Titanic disaster. Estimated death toll 1,500. The Titanic, which entered service on April 2, 1912, was the second of 3 Olympic-class ocean liners and the world's biggest ship. Built on an unparalleled size, the Titanic could transport 3,547 passengers at high speeds and in unmatched luxury over time. Her reciprocating engines were the biggest ever built, standing 40 feet tall and with cylinders 9 feet in diameter, requiring the combustion of 600 long tons of coal every day. The passenger accommodations, particularly the first-class portion, were described as of unparalleled extent and magnificence. The parlor rooms were the most costly and elegant rooms on the ship, with a private promenade costing more than $4,350, which is equivalent to $140,000 now for a one-way transatlantic journey. The Titanic was 4 days into her first trip from Southampton to New York City with an estimated 2,224 passengers on board when she collided with an iceberg at 23:40 on April 14th. Her sinking 2 hours and 40 minutes later at 2:20 ship's time, 5:18 GMT on 15th April, killed almost 1,500 people, making it one of the worst peacetime maritime catastrophes ever. On 14th April, the Titanic received 6 warnings of sea ice, but she was traveling at around 22 knots or 41 kilometers per hour when her lookout saw the iceberg. Unable to turn soon enough, the ship received a glancing hit that bent her starboard side and exposed 6 of her 16 compartments to the sea. Titanic was built to stay afloat if up to 4 of her forward compartments flooded, and the crew employed distress flares and radio signals to summon assistance while the passengers boarded lifeboats. The Titanic's lifeboat system, in accordance with existing practice, was designed to ferry passengers to nearby rescue vessels rather than to hold everyone on board at the same time. Thus, with the ship sinking rapidly and help still hours away, many of the passengers and crew had no safe refuge with only 20 lifeboats, 4 of which were collapsible. Due to poor preparation and handling of the evacuation, several boats were launched before they were fully loaded. The Titanic sank with more than 1,000 passengers and personnel still aboard. Almost everyone who ended out in the water was killed within minutes as a result of cold shock and incapacitation. RMS Carpathia arrived around an hour and a half after the disaster, rescuing all 710 survivors by 9:15 on April 15th. The accident stunned the globe and sparked considerable outcry due to a shortage of lifeboats, inadequate standards, and unfair treatment of third-class passengers during the evacuation. From horrific wars and genocides to natural disasters and pandemics, these events have left indelible marks on mankind, taking millions of lives and changing society. While there are many other atrocities that took place during the 1900s, these events changed the history of several nations during the 1900s.